It's a name you might not be familiar with, but right now it's one of the deadliest jihadist groups in the world.
The scale of the increase in attacks in Burkina Faso and the Sahel region across the board has been frightening.
One of the most audacious was an attack on an airport near Mali's capital last year, rattling the ruling junta. This isn't one homogeneous entity. It's a kaleidoscopic coalition, just like the region itself.
Multiple different entities consisting of different tribes with very distinct leaders in different countries.
And its leaders don't fit the mold of textbook jihadists.
Iyad Ghali walked into an embassy, spoke with American diplomats, and they described him as a quietly spoken, reserved, slightly tired-looking man. Not quite the kind of aggressive, finger-pointing version of the jihadist that we maybe have in our minds.
Their message has a lure in a region that's been beleaguered by military coups, ethnic conflict, and climate change.
Engaging with local people by portraying themselves as we are your protectors, the state are the enemy, the state are killing you, we are protecting you.
Sub-Saharan Africa has become a key battleground for jihadists. In this episode, we put the global jigsaw spotlight on a group called JNIM, an Al-Qaeda affiliate that has firmly planted its flag in the Sahel region. We'll try to understand who they are, where they came from, and what they are fighting for. In part 2, we'll explore the story from the local perspective. I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, exploring the narratives, the propaganda, and the disinformation.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두 당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
JNIM may not be the best-known jihadist group, but its attacks have become a constant feature in the Sahel.
Al-Qaeda's regional proxy, JNIM,
Le départ de Wagner au Mali est-il en train de rabattre les cartes politiques? Le JNIM, l'un des
The Sahel is a huge stretch of the middle belt of Africa, including Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Sudan and Chad. A big part of it is desert, and it's inhabited mostly by pastoral and farming communities who over the last decades have been threatened by Islamist extremists. Our guides to this story are two jihadist media analysts from BBC Monitoring. Barry Marston gives us the size of the problem.
Around 50% of deaths from terrorism in 2024 were in the Sahel region alone, and 25% of those worldwide attacks were just for the country, Burkina Faso.
Those figures come from the Global Terrorism Index compiled by the Institute for Economics and Peace. JNIM's story started in Mali, a country so vast you could fit Western Europe into it.
We've been seeing this steady year-on-year increase in activity by JNIM. They were a group that firstly were very, very active in the centre of Mali, almost exclusively so, but then inexorably year after year expanding north, expanding south throughout Mali itself, into Niger and Burkina Faso, to really being the lion's share as of 2025.
Videos broadcast by the JNIM showed terrorists strolling around and firing randomly into the windows of the presidential hangar.
This is JNIM briefly taking over Bamako airport and a few quarters of the city last September.
And you see experts talking about perhaps around 40% of territory in Burkina Faso alone is nominally in the hands of JNIM and other jihadist entities, gradually growing areas that really aren't in the hands of the central state authorities anymore in any meaningful way.
JNIM have shown a remarkable ability not just to stage attacks, but to hold territory. They control large areas where they are the de facto landlords.
And over the past year or more, Benin has really entered the fray. Over the last few months, a number of really big attacks, killing dozens of soldiers on a number of occasions. So really significant penetration much more widely across the region.
So we sized up the problem. Now let's go back to the basics. What exactly is Jinim again? Jacob Boswell picks up the thread.
Jinim is Al-Qaeda's branch in the Sahel, and the name is an acronym. It stands for Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, which means the group for the support of Islam and Muslims.
Jinim itself actually came into being in 2017, and it was a coalition of multiple jihadist groups across the region that sort of came together.
Mali's main jihadist group said they have merged with two other groups linked with Al-Qaeda. Iyad Ag-Ghali, leader of Ansar-Din, joined with Al-Murabitun, led by Algerian jihadists.
When we see claims from Jinim, we see it just as Jinim. But in fact, this group is still multiple different entities consisting of different tribes with very distinct leaders in different countries.
What do they say is their aim?
This narrative of advocating an Islamic state or the global jihadist narrative has worked very well for them to date, even across those tribal, linguistic and geographic divides. This same agenda of coming to power transnationally, bringing to bear Sharia governance and their own ideological beliefs about how Muslims in those areas should practice. They actively will go out to communities under their influence and seek to impose Islamic punishments and a level of Islamist governance.
To discover the origins of what we now call Jinim, we need to travel north and back in time, Algeria in the 90s.
Those of us who've been around a couple of decades looking into jihadist trends, one of the big epicentres was Algeria for a very long time. Certainly through the 90s and into the early 2000s. We very rarely see attacks in Algeria these days, but many of the key jihadist figures moved down to the south into the Sahel and the Sahara region, became active in fueling some of the insurgencies we've seen since then. So the Maghreb North Africa arena has quietened down remarkably, but it's moved into the Sahel region, very notably those three states, Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso.
The region has often been called the coup belt because of frequent military takeovers in the last few years.
And often the reason given by the military at any one point for these coups, they were saying that the current government isn't doing enough to fight jihadism and we can do a much better job.
L'offensive qui a commencé depuis le mois de novembre contre ces groupes armés terroristes les ont amenés donc à
But in fact, many people on the ground would argue the opposite. This sort of plague of coups over this period has weakened these countries further.
Military coups, weak governance and jihadism have the habit of feeding off each other, and it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Jinim made itself at home in Mali, a former French colony that had been in a prolonged turmoil.
In the 2010s, it was a decade of extreme turbulence in Mali especially. There was the Tuareg rebellion in 2012. Jihadists kind of profited from this instability. And then there were a series of foreign interventions by France and other nations. And in 2017, it was 5 local jihadist groups which came together under the umbrella of Jinim. So we should understand Jinim as a kind of coalition group.
This is key to understand Jinim, its aim and methods. It's a coalition group, and its eclectic nature is what sets it apart from the more single-minded model of a jihadist group.
I think if it was one centralised entity trying to control all of that territory, it would be struggling because we're talking about a multi-tribal region. It's very difficult for one tribe to project its influence across others, particularly the Tuareg in the north of Mali. You've got the Fulani across much of Mali and into Burkina Faso, and then a whole range of different tribes in Burkina Faso and southern Mali itself. So the ability to project influence across that very diverse region is very much hinged on the ability to work across different tribes, but maintain that sort of quite local identity in any one region.
France, the former colonial master, has led 2 counter-terrorism campaigns in Mali, Operation Serval and Barkhane, and it withdrew its forces by the end of 2022. The UN stabilization force called MINUSMA too was asked to leave the country a year later.
In Mali in particular, the coup was contextualized as a move away from France, away from the West, but we're going to embrace Russia.
If Wagner went to liberate Syria, if Wagner went to liberate the Central African Republic, then we welcome Wagner to Bamako to liberate Mali. To the asymmetric war, we propose an asymmetric solution, which is Wagner.
Wagner forces came in, and for example, during the second half of 2023, we were watching as base by base across northern Mali was being evacuated by the UN. You'd see this upsurge in claimed activity by JNIM, by northern insurgents and separatists. It was sort of inviting a new phase of activity by these groups. There was that level of instability, but also Wagner and local forces themselves became quite quickly embroiled in claims of very systematic human rights violations.
Wagner became a magnet for jihadists here, who used the Russian mercenaries' reputation for cruelty to justify their fight.
And the interesting thing was that JNIM itself tried to paint itself as the good guy in this situation. It was putting out statement after statement and videos decrying human rights abuses by the various governments, by Wagner, by local paramilitary forces, and saying they're the ones perpetrating these abuses. We are there to protect local people.
The reality is that abuses have been committed by all sides, militaries, foreign mercenaries, and jihadists. Groups like ACLED, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have regularly provided data on human rights violations. In Burkina Faso, in 2023 alone, more than 8,000 people lost their lives.
And we actually have seen one recent message from JNIM praising Human Rights Watch, a Western institution, for documenting what it called a massacre in Burkina Faso, the Silenzo massacre. This kind of praise of Western institutions from JNIM, it's really unusual, and it does indicate a kind of pragmatism.
And of course, if you look at the situation on the ground, JNIM are just as complicit in massacring and killing civilians as any other party. But by portraying themselves in this way, reaching out to people from the same tribe, from the same district, they were portraying themselves as the protectors of these communities. And that reinforces when they perhaps interacting with these local communities in a way that central governments may never have done at all.
Let's look at the areas JNIM controls and how its different branches operate.
Each branch occupies a particular geographical region. We know that historically what was called Ansar al-Islam, under the Diko brothers, is operating within Burkina Faso. Equally, we know that Ansar ad-Din in northern Mali is operating under Iyad Ghali. These different branches have specific geographical remits. It also corresponds to ethnic differences between different groups, mainly a Tuareg-based sub-branch in northern Mali. You have the Fulani branch, which is more central Mali, under Amadou Koufa.
The branches are rooted in these lands. They're tuned into the needs and grievances of the local communities. And that explains why they have been so successful in turning these to their own advantage and gaining legitimacy in the eyes of the local population at the expense of central governments.
These are incredibly remote regions. They've never been sort of part of the centralised authorities in terms of education, local services. So when a jihadist group rolls up in a particular village and they engage in preaching, they perhaps hand out hijabs and Qurans and then engaging with local people, it can be a very effective recruitment tool and a way of legitimising themselves as we are your friends, the government are not. And that's very much a strong message when it comes to the human rights agenda, by portraying themselves as we are your protectors, the state are the enemy, the state are killing you, we are protecting you.
The main ideological goal of these groups, or JNIM, is to chase out foreign intervention from these countries They say that they are opposed to the regional governments, so that's the governments of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, and anyone who helps them.
To underscore their opposition to the authorities, Jenim branches applaud anyone who criticizes these governments for their human rights violations, even if it's a Western institution. But the anti-Western sentiments are firmly at the core of these groups.
They've always pointed to French and Western influence in these parts of Africa. And these are the Crusader forces. They're there to attack you. They're against your interests. Firstly, it was a propaganda win for them because these Western forces pulled out. And they said, well, they're pulling out because we kicked them out of these countries. But then Wagner came in and they were able to say, well, this is another era of Russian colonialism this time, and we're also going to do the same to the Russians. So they firstly portrayed the Russians as these people are attacking you, they're killing you, they're engaged in human rights violations, but also the fact that Al-Qaeda week in, week out were able to claim attacks against Wagner and the Malian military. It was contributing to their narrative of legitimacy.
So they have this anti-imperialist rhetoric, which is very important. But also clearly they talk about atrocities committed against Muslims. They talk about protecting Muslims. Those are the two kind of key ideological goals that they have.
I understand that organizationally they are very much linked to Al-Qaeda. But where's the jihadist element in their ideology? Where are the global aims?
Well, Jenim came out of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. In terms of their rhetoric and propaganda, they remain affiliated to Al-Qaeda Central. They are adopting all of this transnational jihadist rhetoric and those goals, although in recent months we've seen some interesting changes, slight shifts in the propaganda, which perhaps might suggest that Jenim is really focusing on the more local level, talking about local grievances, trying to appeal to local people rather than transnational jihadism.
We've seen calls in recent weeks for perhaps linkages between the northern separatists and Al-Qaeda, saying if you separate yourself from global jihad and just focus on what is going on in this country, then perhaps we can collaborate. And that could be a politically savvy way for them to go. It would make them perhaps more palatable to other political groups across the region, but it potentially also makes them more dangerous because they're able to form those linkages with other separatists. And it could only be a tactical renunciation of global jihad, saying this is good for us in the short term because we can gain power, but we're not necessarily totally separating ourselves from that longer term commitment to global jihad. This is a group that operates across state borders. It is about Islamic governance across the whole region.
Staging military operations and providing services to local communities requires solid financing. So where does Jenim get its money from?
It's impossible for these groups to sustain themselves unless they are gaining significant revenues from their activities. And it may be done in a relatively benign way by saying that because you are part of our system, you're obliged to pay certain Islamic taxes as part of carrying out your faith. Elsewhere, we have seen this done in a coerced form. It may differ from region to region. By being present across northern Mali and Niger in particular, you must also think of the movement of people, weapons across large areas of the uncontrolled Sahara Desert. We're talking about people smuggling groups, weapons smuggling groups, and to some degree, there are linkages between the jihadists and some of these criminal networks. And the greater the strength of Jenim and other entities across this region, the more they are able to control these networks, to profit from them, but also control them.
In part 2 of this series, we'll explore how the group makes money to finance its operations, and we'll look into more details into something called blood gold. You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's take a look at the men heading up the main branches of Jenim. Like other aspects of this group, these characters too stray from the mold.
Yeah, so there are some really big characters leading Jenim. And Iyad Ghali is probably the most interesting and colourful character. He is a bit of a kind of soldier of fortune, but more than that is also a strategist and has managed to move with the times and remain close to power. He's nicknamed the Lion of the Desert, and he's from the noble Ifoghas clan of the Tuareg people in northern Mali. He went to Libya in the 70s as part of the Ishumar generation, coming from the French chômeur, meaning unemployed. He fought for the Islamic Legion of Gaddafi and was politicized and learned presumably how to fight. He came back in the early 1990s and was a senior commander in a rebellion that took place against the government. But very soon after that, he abandoned the rebellion and helped negotiate a peace deal with the government and remained close to power, and by 2007, incredibly, managed to get picked to be Mali's consul in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and had a somewhat of a good reputation as a kind of peace broker of sorts, so that you could trust with the government. Then, at some point during these years, he obviously started being influenced by more jihadist and sort of Salafist teachings.
It's a fascinating transition to follow. Clearly a devout Islamist figure, but he was also for a very long time seen as a legitimate politician in northern Mali. He was a key figure as an interlocutor between the north and the central state in the sort of 2012 uprising. That was this grouping of both separatists, but also the Al-Qaeda affiliated Islamists who ultimately ended up fighting each other, and that uprising broke down. But that was really what laid the seeds of Jenim, where he fully moved into the Al-Qaeda camp and was seen as an individual who was totally beyond the pale.
After 2012, when the Tuareg rebellion took place, he decided to throw his hat into the ring with the jihadists, which has worked out very well for him because now he's the emir, the top leader of Jenim.
Do you think that's what's driving his choices? You know, this desire to be close to power once he has tasted it? Or is it pure ideology?
I think a lot of people question whether Ghali's religious, his fundamentalist and jihadist beliefs are really there, whether it was more of a cynical attempt to stay close to power. So yeah, I definitely think there's an argument for that. There were cables that were made public by US diplomats in Mali from around 2007, where Iyad Ghali walked into an embassy, spoke with American diplomats, and they described him as a quietly spoken, reserved, slightly tired-looking man. It's not quite the kind of aggressive, finger-pointing version of the jihadist that we maybe have in our minds.
Around 2016, 2017, you then see in the centre of Mali what became known as Katibat Masina, the Masina Liberation Front under Amadou Koufa, Fulani organisation, one of the most active groups of all of them.
Amadou Koufa, he's considered to be the second in command after Ghali, and he's considered a bit of a pragmatist. He is known to allow humanitarian access from international and local groups into the areas where they have influence. He communicates with NGOs, it seems. And interestingly, he actually gives interviews with Western press. He's done a series of interviews with a journalist from France 24. And he claims in these interviews, I guess he would, but he claims that Jenim does not target Western and local humanitarian actors. So he's an interesting character as well. The third one I'd mention is Jafar Diko. So Jafar Diko and his brothers Malam and Usman basically run the Burkina Faso branch of Jenim. It's a bit of a family affair. Jafar reportedly is brutal and uncharismatic, reported in certain local media, but he's thought to enjoy a considerable amount of autonomy in terms of his actions, planning and conducting attacks in Burkina Faso.
Just a reminder, Burkina Faso is now taking the lion's share of jihadist atrocities in the region. Let's look at how Jenim's message travels and how efficient their propaganda is. What can we glean from their media operations?
Well, Jenim has two levels of communication with the outside world. There's the corporate face of Jinim that we see day to day in our monitoring work, which is put out on platforms such as Telegram, Element, Chirpwire, and that all goes through as Zalaka. And Zalaka is essentially the media arm of Jinim. So everything is centralized from Jinim in that one media arm. Then to local populations, we also sometimes see messages going out in other media, so maybe through a Facebook video or maybe through a printed document that is circulated on the ground. We also hear that sometimes the group might communicate with WhatsApp voice messages in local languages. Language is a really important element of all of this because, of course, Arabic is how Jinim wants to present itself to the outside world, but to local people, Arabic literacy will be quite low, so local languages will be much more important.
How successful do you think they are in selling their ideas to the local population?
You have to remember that we're talking about countries with very, very poor state services. In some cases, the state actually only reaches about 30% of the territory. There's really very little justice system. There's no basic services. You have very large youth populations. You have the effects of climate change. And in all of this, Jinim tries to push itself as being able to offer not only a dignified life, but a life which is actually abundant. During a recent Eid propaganda output, Jinim were really hammering home the fact that they have lots of food. The food was really at the center of this picture. There were hundreds of photos showing fizzy drinks, showing fruit, showing lamb being roasted. And it's really calling for young, very impoverished men who don't have perhaps an employment to come and join the group, where you can be fed, enjoy a dignified life, and also live in the ways of Islam.
Jinim have been very proudly showing off videos and photos of these various training grounds it has across parts of Mali, creating an environment where more either locals or people from other countries and the other continents even can come and join this, what they think of as jihad. Certainly the training and the ideological element is really key to that.
To recap, this is the most active jihadist group in the Sahel, where they are in their own element. What's next for the group?
The scale of the increase in attacks in Burkina Faso and the Sahel region across the board has been frightening. They're getting greater control of territory, larger attacks, reaching across broader areas.
The general shift seems to be that Jinim is moving further south and expanding into northern Benin, but also northern Togo. Been a couple of attacks there. We noticed that some statements about general global topics, which previously had the branding of both Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, and Jinim, Zalaka. And one of those was removed, and it was the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, leaving only Jinim's official branding. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, and it hasn't applied to all statements, but it was an interesting, very, very subtle change in the output. And it would seem that by dropping the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, it could be of the first step moving towards essentially cutting ties with Al-Qaeda. It hasn't happened yet, but that seems to be a possible.
It looks like the two groups stopped issuing joint statements and started getting their comms out independently.
If they were to completely shed the Al-Qaeda kind of cloak, then it would perhaps free them up to openly coordinating with other separatist groups, such as the FLA, Independence Movement in Mali. There are some subtle signs that they are already doing this, but they can't do it explicitly, to ever coordinate with a quote-unquote infidel group or a apostate group. But if they were to move away from the Al-Qaeda umbrella, then of course, it gives them significant strategic scope to work with new partners.
While piecing together the jihadist global jigsaw in the past, we have explored the more pragmatic spectrum of the jihadist movement. Take Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, another Al-Qaeda offshoot whose leader Ahmed al-Shara is now the interim ruler of Syria and who recently shook hands with Donald Trump. This departure from transnational goals towards local governance is not new.
That seems to be the model that is working, a version of political Islam or kind of Islamism that actually accepts the necessity of a national border, for example. It accepts working with allies, the things that hardcore jihadists don't agree with.
As we've discussed in the past, the global jihadist movement is far from united in terms of the future direction of jihad. One success story that many jihadists are drawing inspiration from might be relevant here.
HTS taking over in Syria is a recent development, but certainly since then it seems that JNIM might be looking towards Syria for inspiration. And a few times we've heard a little bit of chatter through the channels that we monitor where al-Qaeda supporters have been questioning what is the best overall grand strategy for al-Qaeda and its branches, and saying increasingly, well, perhaps something more of a middle way, a kind of pragmatic jihadism light, if you like, is a good way to go, and talking about how JNIM might be on the path to doing that.
Al-Shabaab and JNIM and other al-Qaeda branches are totally unashamed of looking at the Taliban experience. The US withdrew and the Taliban came to power. Very often in al-Qaeda propaganda, they will cite that Afghanistan example and say, we can do that elsewhere. So that was certainly a real source of inspiration, that if you stick at it long enough, you keep on fighting, ultimately they will say that according to Islamic scriptures, we are the ones who are predestined to come out and to prevail in this struggle.
And we wrap up part 1 of our look at JNIM. Thank you to Barry Marston and Jacob Boswell. In part 2, we'll explore the narratives of the warring sides and the intersection between the JNIM operations and daily life in this hard-to-control part of Africa. This episode was produced by Krista Shaturi, the technical producer was Elchin Suleimanov, the sound engineer is Martin Appleby, and I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig. Thank you for listening from all of us.